What if everything you had, your wealth, your health, your family, was taken from you in an instant? Could you still believe? Could you still trust in something greater when everything around you was falling apart? This is not just any story. This is the story of a man who lost everything, yet never let go of his faith. A story of unimaginable suffering, yet unwavering trust. A story that has stood the test of time and continues to inspire millions. Job's life was a masterpiece of faith, a testament to the power of resilience. He was a man who knew abundance, but also knew despair. He was tested in ways that most of us will never comprehend, and yet, his faith remained unshaken. In a world where many turn away from faith at the first sign of hardship, Job's story challenges us. What does it truly mean to believe? Is faith only for the good times, or is it forged in the fire of trials? Prepare yourself to see this story like never before. A journey through pain, perseverance, and ultimate restoration. By the end, you'll not only understand Job's story, you'll see yourself in it. This is more than just a biblical tale. It's a roadmap for anyone who has ever felt lost, broken, or abandoned. And by the time we reach the final chapter, you'll realize one powerful truth. Faith, when tested, becomes unbreakable. The sun had barely reached its peak when a messenger burst into Job's house, breathless, eyes wide with terror. Enemies had attacked, killed the servants, and taken all the cattle. A cruel, unexpected blow. Job listened intently, refusing to let despair consume him. Faith isn't dictated by circumstances, but by trust in God. As the messenger spoke, another arrived, covered in dust and sweat, his face marked by horror. Fire from the sky fell upon the sheep and shepherds, consuming everything in flames. Job remained motionless. Many would have crumbled, but he took a deep breath. What is lost in the physical world does not define the strength of the soul. Before Job could process the situation, a third messenger arrived, trembling. The Chaldeans attacked the camels and killed the servants with swords. Another colossal loss. Wealth accumulated over years, gone in an instant. But Job knew, material riches are fleeting. True treasure lies in resilience and faith. Imagine losing everything in a single day, your job, home, savings, all wiped away. How would you react? Panic? Anger? Job could have cursed the heavens, but he didn't. He understood something few do. Trust in God transcends earthly pain. The news spread quickly. Neighbors whispered, some murmuring that Job must have done something wrong to deserve such calamity. But life has mysterious ways of testing those who truly believe. Job refused to be shaken by their words. Most see loss as the end. But what if it's just the beginning? Job had no idea what lay ahead, but he chose not to sink into suffering. Many give up at the first sign of hardship, failing to see that endurance is the path to something greater. Job's pain was real, intense, piercing. There's nothing wrong with sorrow, with mourning loss. But the real question is, what comes after the tears? He could have surrendered to despair, but he chose to believe. Job looked toward the horizon, searching for answers in a silent sky. He knew his possessions did not define him. His strength came from something far deeper. How often do people place their identity in what they own, failing to see real value within? When everything is going well, trusting is easy, but true faith is tested when everything falls apart. Job was shaken by unimaginable losses, yet he remained steadfast. The question is, what do you hold on to when everything crumbles? The silence that followed was louder than any lament. Job didn't have all the answers, but he had one certainty. God was still there. And when you believe that, no matter what happens, hope can never be destroyed. Job's reaction could have been rebellion, but instead he bowed in humility. He understood that everything comes and goes, but faith remains. When was the last time you were grateful for what you have, even in difficulty? Time seemed to slow. As the dust of the news hung in the air, Job understood life is unpredictable. One day, everything is in place. The next, nothing remains. But that doesn't mean God has abandoned you. What if your greatest loss was actually the turning point to something bigger? We often only see the greatness of a plan after it unfolds. Job didn't know what was coming, but he knew his story wouldn't end there. If you were in Job's place, what would you do? Many turn away from God in pain, but Job did the opposite. He chose to remain. Faith is not just about feelings, but about what we choose to do, even in hardship. Job's reality had changed drastically, but his soul remained unshaken. He understood something fundamental. Losing possessions is not the same as losing purpose. And as long as there is purpose, there is a reason to keep going. Sometimes, life empties us to fill us with something greater. Job could have clung to the past, but he decided to move forward. And you? Are you holding on to something you should have let go of? Trust means knowing that even without understanding, something bigger is at work. The night fell upon Job, but he did not despair. Instead, he prepared for what was to come, because darkness never lasts forever, and those who believe know that dawn always arrives. The first day of losses had ended, but the test was far from over, and just when Job thought he had faced the worst, another storm was forming on the horizon. Just when Job thought the worst had passed, another messenger arrived, eyes filled with dread. This time, the news was even heavier. A powerful windstorm struck the house where all his children were gathered. The walls collapsed, and no one survived. Job stood frozen. The weight of the moment crushed his chest, but deep inside, he knew. Faith isn't built in times of ease, but in the fire of trials. Imagine losing not just wealth, but those dearest to you. It's one thing to face financial ruin, but when the people you love most are taken, how do you go on? Many would sink into despair, questioning everything. But Job, he mourned, he grieved, yet his heart still whispered, God is in control, even when everything seems lost. As the dust settled, Job tore his robe and shaved his head, a symbol of deep sorrow in his time. He fell to the ground, not in defeat, but in worship. Who does that? Who worships after losing everything? Only someone who understands that life is more than what can be seen, more than what can be possessed. Many people only praise God when things are going well. But what about when tragedy strikes? Do you still believe? Job's response challenges us. If your faith is conditional, is it really faith at all? Trust in God isn't based on circumstances, but on his unchanging nature. Job's friends and neighbors watched in shock. Some whispered that he must have done something to deserve this. After all, doesn't suffering come as a punishment? But Job knew better. He didn't understand why this was happening, but he refused to blame God. He held on to something greater than explanations. He held on to trust. People often search for answers in tragedy. Why me? What did I do wrong? But sometimes, the answer doesn't come. Sometimes all we have is the choice, to cling to faith or let go. Job made his choice. He grieved, but he did not let grief define him. Can you imagine standing at the grave of all your children, knowing you'll never hear their laughter again? Job faced a sorrow beyond words. Yet even then, he did not curse God. He had lost everything, but he had not lost his soul. Pain changes people. Some become bitter, shutting their hearts to love, to hope. But others, like Job, allow suffering to refine them. They choose to trust even when the reasons are unclear. This is the kind of resilience that turns tragedy into testimony. Loss is a universal experience. Maybe you haven't lost everything like Job, but you faced hardship, a broken relationship, a lost dream, an unexpected betrayal. The question is, how do you respond? Do you let it break you, or do you rise with renewed strength? Job's name was once associated with prosperity. Now it was tied to sorrow. But even in grief, he refused to let bitterness take root. He knew that what defines a person isn't what they have, but who they choose to be in the worst moments of life. His wife, broken by the pain, questioned him. Why do you still hold on to your integrity? Curse God and die. The weight of suffering had crushed her, but Job's response was different. He would not curse the one who had given him life, even in loss. Some people abandon faith when hardships come. If God loved me, he wouldn't let this happen. But faith isn't about avoiding suffering. It's about enduring through it. Job didn't serve God because life was easy. He served because he believed, no matter what. It's easy to trust when things are good, but real faith is tested in darkness. Job's story isn't about a perfect man. It's about a man who, even in sorrow, refused to let go of God. And that is what makes all the difference. Have you ever experienced loss so deep it felt like your heart would never recover? In those moments, it's tempting to let go of faith. But what if that's when faith is needed most? Job clung to God, not because he understood, but because he chose to believe. The enemy had taken everything from Job, his wealth, his family, his peace. But there was one thing he could not take: Job's unwavering trust. When everything else was gone, that was what remained. Life can be unpredictable. One moment you have everything, the next, it's slipping through your fingers. The lesson? Hold on to what truly lasts. And that isn't wealth, or status, or even security. It's the faith that carries you through every storm. Job's suffering wasn't over. The worst had happened, but another wave of trials was coming. Would he continue to hold on? Would he stand firm in faith, or would he finally break? Only time would tell. As the night fell, Job sat in silence. The echoes of his children's laughter now only memories. The pain was unbearable, but his spirit was unshaken. And just when it seemed like he had endured the worst, the next test was about to begin. Just when it seemed that Job had endured enough, another wave of suffering crashed over him. His body, once strong and healthy, was now covered in painful sores from head to toe. The disease spared no part of him. His skin cracked, his flesh burned, and every movement sent waves of agony through his body. Yet even in this torment, Job did not speak against God. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that your body is failing you. The things you once took for granted, walking, eating, even sleeping, become unbearable struggles. Job had lost his wealth and his family, and now his own body had turned against him. Yet, he refused to curse God. Would you have the same strength? His appearance changed drastically. The once respected man, known for his wisdom and success, was now unrecognizable. People who once sought his advice now turned their faces away in disgust. But true faith is not measured in times of honor. It is revealed in moments of rejection. Job's wife, overwhelmed by grief and exhaustion, could no longer bear to see his suffering. "Why do you still hold on to your integrity? Curse God and die," she cried. Her words were not just out of anger, but deep despair. How many times do people, when pushed to their limits, abandon faith instead of clinging to it? But Job, even in his misery, refused to give in. "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" he responded. These words reveal a truth few understand. Faith is not a transaction. It is not about receiving only blessings, but about trusting even in the storm. Covered in sores, sitting in ashes, Job took a broken piece of pottery and scraped his wounds. His pain was more than physical. It was emotional, spiritual, existential. Yet he did not let his agony dictate his beliefs. His faith remained, even when everything else was stripped away. Can you imagine what it feels like to be abandoned by everyone? His friends kept their distance. The same people who once celebrated his success now avoided him, as if suffering were contagious. But suffering does not define a person. How they respond to it does. Job could have drowned in self-pity, but he did not. Instead, he chose to endure. It is easy to believe when life is smooth, but what about when everything falls apart? Real faith is forged in adversity, not comfort. Society often values people based on what they have. When Job had wealth, status, and health, he was respected. Now, with nothing, he was treated as worthless. How many times do we judge others based on their circumstances rather than their character? In the face of suffering, many search for someone to blame: God, themselves, others. But Job resisted this temptation. He did not understand why this was happening, but he knew one thing: his suffering did not mean that God had abandoned him. His breath was foul, his skin was peeling, his strength was gone. Even his closest friends could barely look at him. But Job was more than his suffering. His identity was not in his disease, but in his trust in God. Pain isolates. Job once surrounded by family and friends, now sat alone. The silence around him was as painful as the disease itself. But in that silence, he clung to faith. When was the last time you trusted God in the middle of silence? His faith did not erase his pain, but it gave him purpose. He questioned, he mourned, but he did not give up. Sometimes, faith is not about having all the answers. It is about holding on even when the answers do not come. Job's sores were visible to all, but the greatest wounds are often unseen. Emotional scars, broken hearts, crushed dreams, these are the battles many fight silently. Job's story reminds us that suffering is not the end of the story. Every day was a battle between pain and perseverance, but Job chose perseverance, not because he understood why he suffered, but because he trusted that there was a purpose beyond his understanding. The disease had taken his health, but it could not take his hope. And that is the essence of faith, not the absence of pain, but the presence of trust despite the pain. Do you trust even when you cannot see the reason? The night was long, the days were painful, but Job endured. He had no answers, no relief, no guarantees. Yet he refused to curse God. Faith is not proven in comfort, it is proven in fire. Job had lost his family, his wealth, and now his health. But even as he sat in the ashes, suffering in silence, he was unaware that his greatest test was still to come. Job sat in silence, his body weak, his heart heavy. Yet, through the suffering, he refused to let go of his faith. Even when everything pointed toward despair, he clung to the one thing that remained, his trust in God. Because faith isn't about having all the answers, it's about holding on when everything else is falling apart. Days turned into nights, and still, Job did not waver. His suffering had become a test of endurance, a battle between pain and perseverance. Would he curse God? Would he give in to bitterness? Many expected him to break, but Job's faith was rooted in something deeper than circumstance. His friends came, intending to comfort him, but instead, they questioned him. "Surely you have done something wrong," they implied. "Why else would God allow this?" But Job knew the truth. Faith is not measured by blessings alone. Sometimes, the greatest faith is shown in the darkest moments. Imagine facing hardship, and instead of comfort, you receive accusations. Job's friends didn't understand that suffering is not always a punishment. Yet, he remained steadfast, refusing to let their words shake his confidence in God's plan. His body was failing, his wealth was gone, and his children were no more. Yet Job did not lose the most important thing, his belief that God was still in control. This kind of resilience is rare. How many people would still believe when everything has been stripped away? Job cried out, not in rebellion, but in honest lament. "Why is this happening?" he asked. His faith did not mean he couldn't question. It meant that even in questioning, he still trusted. Faith isn't about blind obedience. It's about trust even when we don't understand. He longed for answers, but none came. The heavens were silent, yet his faith remained. How often do we demand immediate answers? But sometimes, the test is in the waiting. Job understood this, and so he endured. His pain did not disappear, but neither did his belief. Some people see suffering as the absence of God. But what if suffering is where faith is truly refined? Job's faith wasn't shaken, it was strengthened. The more his friends pressed him, the more he stood firm. He refused to curse God, even when they insisted he should. True faith doesn't shift with opinions. It stands unmoved, even when questioned. Job wasn't perfect, but he was faithful. He wrestled with his pain. He cried out in confusion, but he never turned away. What does your faith look like in suffering? Is it built on circumstances, or is it built on something deeper? His friends continued to argue, searching for reasons behind his suffering. "You must have sinned," they insisted. But Job refused to accept their logic. He knew that faith isn't about earning blessings. It's about trusting, no matter what. How many times do we try to make sense of suffering? We want clear reasons, simple explanations. But Job's story reminds us that sometimes there are no easy answers. And yet, faith remains. Job's perseverance wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about holding on to God, even in the worst moments. He had lost everything, but he still had faith. And that was more powerful than any wealth. Even when his mind was filled with doubts, Job still trusted. Faith is not the absence of doubt. It is choosing to believe, even in the face of uncertainty. That's the difference between shallow belief and true, unshakable trust. Job could have walked away from his faith. He could have listened to his friends, to his wife, to his pain, but he didn't. He held firm because deep down, he knew that faith is not just for the good times. It is for the storms. Many people see suffering as a reason to walk away from God. But what if suffering is actually the place where we meet Him most? Job's pain didn't drive him away. It brought him closer to the very essence of faith. The days stretched on, and Job remained faithful. Though his body was weak, his spirit was strong. Because real faith isn't about feeling good. It's about holding on when nothing feels right. Job had survived the worst, but his journey was far from over. His perseverance had been tested, but the true answer to his suffering had yet to be revealed. Job's suffering had no end in sight. Days turned into weeks, and his body grew weaker. He could no longer eat, his appetite was gone, his strength fading. Even standing became an unbearable task. His once powerful frame was now frail, and every step felt like lifting the weight of the world. Hunger gnawed at his body, but his spirit remained steadfast. There was no comfort, no relief, just a long, agonizing wait. How many times do we take something as simple as food or movement for granted? When it's stripped away, we realize how fragile we truly are. His skin clung to his bones, his muscles wasted away. He who once walked with confidence now lay in the dust, unable to rise. What happens when the strongest among us are brought to their knees? Job was living proof that even the mightiest can be humbled. Imagine losing not just your wealth and family, but also your ability to perform even the most basic functions of life. Job's suffering extended beyond the physical. It was a test of endurance, of faith in the unseen, of perseverance when all hope seemed lost. The world around him moved on, but Job remained frozen in time, trapped in his own agony. His friends came and went, offering words but no real comfort. How often do people try to fix suffering with mere words, failing to understand the depth of another's pain? Nights were the worst. With no food to nourish his body, no strength to move, and no rest from his torment, Job battled against exhaustion and despair. His mind, though weary, still clung to a single truth. God was still there, even in the silence. His breath was weak, his voice barely a whisper. When everything is taken away, when even the strength to speak is gone, what remains? Faith is not about feeling strong. It's about holding on when there is nothing left. His days stretched endlessly, the pain unrelenting. He longed for relief, but none came. Yet through it all, he did not turn against God. This is the kind of faith that cannot be shaken, even when every reason to give up is present. Those around him watched, some in pity, others in judgment. They whispered, wondering what sin had brought him to this state. But Job knew that suffering does not always mean punishment. Sometimes it is a test, a refining fire that reveals true character. How easy it would have been for Job to curse God, to give up, to stop believing. Many would have done so in his place. But real faith is not proven in comfort. It is forged in hardship, in the moments when quitting seems like the only option. His body may have been deteriorating, but his soul remained unbroken. It is a rare kind of resilience, the ability to endure suffering without letting it consume who you are. Can you say that your faith would survive such a trial? Job's past felt like a distant memory. The man who once dined in luxury now lay in the dust, forgotten by the world. But he was not forgotten by God. When all else fails, when people turn away, God remains. He could barely lift his head, let alone take a step. And yet, he lived. Some might say he merely survived, but in reality, he was doing something far greater. He was proving that faith is not dependent on circumstances. When was the last time you faced a challenge that tested your faith? Would you still believe if everything was taken from you? Job's story forces us to reflect. Is our trust in God based on comfort, or does it endure in trials? Many would have begged for death, for an end to the suffering. Job, however, endured, not because he understood why, but because he refused to abandon hope. This is the essence of unwavering trust, not needing to understand, but believing anyway. The world often measures strength by power, wealth, or influence. But Job's story shows us something greater. True strength is revealed when you have nothing left but still refuse to let go of your faith. The sun continued to rise and set, though Job could barely see it through his pain. He did not know when or if his suffering would end, and yet he continued to wait. Because sometimes, faith is simply refusing to let go. Job's body was failing, but his spirit endured. He had not yet received his restoration, but he believed. Little did he know, his suffering was nearing its climax, and a shift was about to take place. The darkest night always precedes the dawn. Job had suffered immeasurably, losing his wealth, his children, his health. Yet, despite everything, he had never abandoned his faith. And now, the moment he had unknowingly been waiting for had arrived. God was about to restore everything he had lost, but with even greater abundance. After all the pain, after all the unanswered questions, Job finally heard God's voice. It wasn't in the form of a gentle whisper, but in a storm, a powerful reminder that God's ways are beyond human understanding. Sometimes we seek quiet answers, but God responds in ways we could never expect. God did not explain Job's suffering, nor did he justify his actions. Instead, he revealed his greatness, showing Job the vastness of creation, the power of his hand. And in that moment, Job understood. Faith is not about having all the answers, but about trusting the one who does. Humbled and in awe, Job repented, not for sin, but for doubting God's wisdom. His suffering had refined him, proving that faith is not dependent on circumstances, but on trust in the divine plan. How often do we demand explanations when what we truly need is trust? Then, the restoration began. God did not simply return what had been taken. He multiplied it. Job received twice as much as before. His livestock increased, his land flourished, his wealth overflowed. What was lost had been replaced with something even greater. But the greatest blessing was yet to come. Job, who had buried his children, was now given new life through sons and daughters. The pain of loss could never be erased, but God, in his mercy, brought beauty from the ashes. No suffering is wasted when placed in God's hands. Job's daughters were described as the most beautiful in the land. Not only did God restore, but he gave more than anyone could have imagined. It was a sign. When God restores, he does so in ways that exceed human expectation. Imagine losing everything and believing that your story has ended. Now imagine that same story being rewritten with blessings beyond anything you thought possible. That was Job's reality, and it can be yours too. What seems like the end is often just the beginning. Job was given 140 more years to live. He saw his children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. The man who had once sat in ashes now lived in abundance, a testament to what God can do for those who remain faithful. Many would have turned away from God after such suffering, but Job proved that true faith is not transactional. He had worshipped God in both loss and restoration. His life was proof that those who endure will see the goodness of God in the land of the living. If you are in a season of loss, let Job's story remind you, God is not finished. Restoration may not come when or how you expect, but when it does, it will be greater than you ever imagined. Faith is not about understanding every step, but trusting the journey. How often do we give up before the breakthrough? Job could have cursed God and walked away, but he held on. And in the end, his perseverance led to a life more abundant than before. Endurance produces reward. Job's friends had doubted him, had accused him, but in the end, they witnessed his restoration. Those who questioned his faith saw firsthand that God is faithful. The same people who underestimated you will one day see how God lifts you up. Suffering does not mean God has abandoned you. It is often in the deepest trials that he is working the most. Job thought his story was over, but God had something far greater planned. What if your struggles are preparing you for something unimaginable? Faith is not just about surviving the storm. It is about standing to witness the rainbow after it passes. Job endured his trials, and in return, he saw the full measure of God's grace. Will you endure long enough to see your own restoration? God's restoration is not just about returning what was lost, but about increasing beyond measure. Job did not simply get back what he had. He received far more. When God moves, He does not bring you back to where you were. He lifts you higher. Imagine standing at the end of your life, looking back at the trials, the suffering, and then realizing that every hardship led to something greater. That is Job's legacy, and it can be yours too. Every struggle has a purpose when entrusted to God. Job's life ended not in despair, but in fulfillment. He left behind a story of faith, endurance, and divine restoration. And as he took his final breath, he knew God had been faithful all along. Job's life had been restored beyond what he could have imagined. Not only was his wealth multiplied, but his heart was filled with joy once more. God blessed him with sons and daughters, filling his home with laughter and love. What was once a house of mourning was now a place of celebration. His daughters were the most beautiful in the land, and unlike tradition, Job granted them an inheritance alongside their brothers. This was a testament to his renewed heart, a man who had seen suffering, yet still chose to give generously and love deeply. Imagine the contrast. The same man who had once sat in ashes, covered in sores, now walked among his children, hearing their laughter, embracing their presence. Every moment was a reminder of God's goodness, of how restoration is always greater than loss. Job had grandchildren and great-grandchildren, watching generations flourish before his eyes. He was no longer the man who had lost everything. He was the patriarch of a blessed lineage, a symbol of endurance and divine faithfulness. How often do we think our story ends at suffering? Job's life teaches us that pain is only a chapter, not the entire book. What seems like a dead end can be the beginning of a greater legacy, one that impacts future generations. Job's home, once silent with grief, was now alive with the sounds of family. His trials had not been in vain. They had prepared him to appreciate every blessing, to cherish what truly matters. Suffering had refined him, not defined him. He shared wisdom with his children, guiding them with the lessons he had learned. His suffering had given him a depth of understanding that only trials can teach. Now he passed down that wisdom, ensuring that his legacy was not just wealth but knowledge and faith. Many people let their past define them. Job, however, used his past as a foundation for something greater. He did not dwell in bitterness. He lived in gratitude. Every sunrise was a gift, every family gathering a miracle. The years passed, but Job never forgot what he had endured. Instead of dwelling on his losses, he focused on what he had gained. His children's voices filled his heart with peace, a peace that surpassed understanding. He had lived to see his great-grandchildren run through the fields, to hold them in his arms, to whisper words of faith into their ears. His greatest blessing was not his wealth, but the family that surrounded him, a living testimony of God's restoration. Time had healed his wounds, but it was his faith that had carried him. Job had not only survived, he had thrived. His story was not one of defeat, but of triumph through trust in God's greater plan. Imagine the fulfillment of seeing not just your children, but their children's children, knowing that your legacy continues. Job had lost much, but in the end, he gained more than he ever dreamed possible. What if Job had given up in his darkest days? What if he had cursed God and turned away? He would have never lived to see this beautiful ending. His perseverance was the bridge that led him to his greatest blessings. We all face trials, but Job's story reminds us that they do not last forever. Those who hold on will see the goodness of God in their lifetime. Restoration is not just a promise, it is a reality for those who believe. Job's name had once been associated with suffering, but now it was synonymous with victory. His endurance became his testimony, a message that still echoes through time. Trust God, even when you don't understand. In his old age, Job reflected on his journey. He had walked through the fire, but he had come out purified. He had wrestled with sorrow, but joy had the final say. He had questioned, but in the end, his faith remained unshaken. Job's days were long, filled with love, laughter, and the presence of those he cherished. He had lived to see the goodness of God, to witness the fulfillment of his promises. His suffering had been temporary, but his blessings were eternal. As he took his final breath, Job knew he had lived a full life. He had seen suffering, but he had also seen redemption. And in his last moment, he rested in peace, knowing that his faith had carried him through it all. Job's days on earth were long and full. After all his suffering, he lived for 140 more years, seeing 4 generations come after him. He was no longer the man who had lost everything. He was now the patriarch of a thriving family, a testimony of faith and endurance. His name, once spoken in sorrow, was now celebrated with honor. People looked at his life and saw the undeniable hand of God. Job had been tested, but he had been restored. His story became one of the greatest demonstrations of divine faithfulness. Imagine living long enough to see your great-grandchildren play at your feet, to witness the fruit of a life rebuilt by God's grace. Job had been brought lower than most could endure, yet he rose higher than anyone could have expected. As he aged, his wisdom became his greatest treasure. People came from near and far to hear his words, to learn from the man who had walked through fire and emerged refined. His trials had given him knowledge that only suffering can teach. He spoke not as a man who had never faced hardship, but as one who had overcome it. Job's life was proof that faith does not remove suffering, it carries us through it. His words, shaped by experience, resonated deeply with those who sought understanding. Though his body aged, his spirit remained strong. He had seen the worst and experienced the best. His faith had not only survived the storm, it had been strengthened by it. And so, he lived in gratitude, cherishing every moment. Job knew that his time on earth was coming to an end. He had lived a life full of lessons, love, and divine restoration. He prepared his family, ensuring they understood the value of faith and perseverance. On his final days, his home was filled with laughter, not sorrow. His children and grandchildren gathered around, listening to his stories, his wisdom, his testimony. He was not departing in despair, but in peace, knowing he had fulfilled his purpose. He had once questioned God, but now he understood. Life was not about avoiding suffering, but about trusting in the one who restores. Job had found peace, not in having all the answers, but in knowing that God was always in control. The day came when Job took his final breath. It was not a moment of fear, but of fulfillment. His eyes closed, not in sorrow, but in the contentment of a life well lived. He left this world knowing his story would inspire countless generations. His name was never forgotten. Job became a symbol of endurance, of unwavering trust in God. His legacy was not just in wealth or family, but in the faith that carried him through both trials and triumphs. Those who heard his story were changed. They saw that no amount of suffering could separate a person from God's plan. Job's life was a reminder that, in the end, faith is rewarded beyond measure. Today, his story continues to be told, bringing hope to those facing hardship. Job's testimony transcends time, proving that even in our darkest moments, God is still working. What would have happened if Job had given up? If he had cursed God and walked away from his faith? He would have never seen his restoration, his legacy, his redemption. His story teaches us that endurance is never in vain. Each of us faces trials, but Job's life reminds us that suffering does not have the final word. Those who trust in God will see the goodness of the Lord in their lifetime. Pain is temporary. Restoration is eternal. Job's final gift to the world was his unwavering trust. He had lost everything, but gained even more. He proved that no suffering is wasted when placed in God's hands. His faith was his greatest inheritance. Imagine standing at the end of your life, looking back at the challenges, the trials, and realizing that every hardship led to something greater. That was Job's reality. His struggles were not his end. They were his beginning. Job's life was a masterpiece of faith, a testimony to perseverance, a blueprint for trusting God even when we do not understand. And as his story lives on, it continues to remind us that restoration always follows faithfulness. Job's story is not just about loss, it's about perseverance, trust, and the unimaginable rewards of faith. His life teaches us that suffering is temporary, but the strength of belief lasts forever. Now I ask you, how do you face your trials? Do you give up when things get tough? Or do you hold on, knowing that something greater awaits? The challenges you face today could be the foundation of your greatest testimony. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting, even when you don't understand. If Job had given up, he never would have seen the restoration that was waiting for him. What blessings could be on the other side of your perseverance? This story isn't just about Job, it's about you, your struggles, your doubts, your moments of weakness. But just like Job, you have the power to endure, to trust, and to see the goodness of God unfold in your life. Don't let your suffering define you. Let your faith do that. Every hardship carries a lesson, every setback a new opportunity for growth. What will you take from your struggles? How will you let them shape your future? If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs encouragement. And if you want to keep learning and strengthening your faith, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. There's so much more to discover, and your journey is just beginning.